I am absolutely delighted to be chairing this session. My name is Shweta Ghosh. I am a lecturer and filmmaker based at the department. Well, I'm just so excited to be here, to be at the Walter Salles Symposium and to hear from our three speakers today. We will be having 20 minutes each for each of the papers, and I will use a 3-minute indication, and we'll have some time at the end for discussion. I'd like to quickly introduce each of our speakers, and then we can get on with the paper presentations. So our first speaker is Dr. Claire Williams, who is an associate professor in Brazilian literature and culture at the University of Oxford. Her research focuses on 20th and 21st century women's writing, minority writing, and life writing from the Lusophone world, and her research interests include cinema and translation. Our second speaker is Professor Cecilia Mello. She's a professor of film in the Department of Film, Radio and Television, University of Sao Paulo, Brazil, and currently visiting scholar at King's College, London. She's the author of The Cinema of Jia Juncker, Realism and Memory in Chinese Film. And our third speaker is our very own Professor Lucia Najib. Lucia is a professor of film at the University of Reading. Her research has focused, among other subjects, on polycentric approaches to world cinema, new waves and new cinemas, cinematic realism, and intermediality. She's the author of many, many books, and the editor of many books as well, and the writer and director, along with Samuel Paiva, of the award-winning feature-length documentary Passages. So if Dr. Claire Williams would like to get started.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you also to Lucia for inviting me, and for the University of Reading for hosting me and the other participants. This is such a pleasure to be part of this event. I'm not really a film person, although I do teach film at Oxford. I'm more of a literature person. So when I approach film, I do it very much with my literary eyes. And I'd like to thank all the first panel, the speakers who have kind of laid the ground for a lot of what I'm going to talk about. I think there will be echoes between all the papers throughout. And also going back to what we heard yesterday, the wonderful conversation between Walter Salles and Laura Mulvey. Thanks to Natalia for talking about the road movie, because my paper really sort of carries on from hers. And apologies to Walter Salles for quoting things in his name. It's rather... I feel rather self-conscious speaking in front of him, but it's also a great pleasure that he's here. Diários de Motocicleta is a film with a strong Latin American identity. It was put together with funding from Argentina, Chile, Peru, France, the UK, and the US. The screenplay was written by a Puerto Rican, José Rivera, the music composed by an Argentinian, Gustavo Santaolalla, and it was directed by a Brazilian, Walter Salles, filming in Spanish for the first time. Furthermore, the project involved local crews and production companies and used actors from across the continent to work in the 11 main locations. 90% of the cast were non-professionals recruited on site. The Motorcycle Diaries, like Central Station, can be read on many levels, and maybe this accounts for its wide appeal. It's a road movie, it's the biopic of a hero to be, a travelogue and guide to sites of symbolic significance, and a Bildungsroman-like representation of two young men's rites of passage as they mature emotionally and politically, learning from the people they meet on their journey across the continent. The last spoken words of the film, taken from the beginning of Che Guevara's Notes on a Latin American Journey, are his in voiceover, recognizing that I'm not the person I was after crossing our America with a capital A. I'd like to reflect on some of these aspects and considering the construction of a Latin American identity through the film that recognises differences but celebrates similarities and common struggles. The road movie provides the perfect structure for stories of self-discovery, as we were talking about before, and this one, following the route taken by Ernesto Guevara and Alberto Granado 50 years ago, 50 years before the film was made, turned out to be a voyage of discovery for cast and crew too. In the cast and crew interviews on the DVD, Salles declared afterwards that he felt that he now knew he was a Latin American filmmaker. We can ask him if he still feels that. And Gael Garcia Bernal, the actor who plays Ernesto Guevara, said he felt like a biographer in the way he was recreating the journey and seeing things through his character's eyes. Thus, the audience accompanies Ernesto, Alberto, Gael, Rodrigo, who plays Alberto, and Walter through modernizing cities, arid desert, snowy mountains, lush pastures, humid jungle, and along endless highways as they observe the changes in landscape and customs, food, accents, music, vocabulary, and clothing. Salles capitalised on the actors' reactions to the scenery, architecture, and natural wonders they passed, and made the most of serendipitous encounters along the way. Unscripted, improvised meetings with curious passers-by added to the sense of authentic interaction between the travellers and the real Latin America, making the film porous in the director's words. Fittingly, improvisation is also the method Ernesto claims during the first minute of the film that the pair will use to complete their journey. Método improvisación. Indeed, their limited resources mean that they often have to use their wits to rely on the kindness of strangers, and they're frequently touched by the generosity of their humble hosts. By travelling the cheapest way, they come into contact with the poorest members of society and are able to observe how they live and how they survive against threats of progress. Ernesto is brutally frank, honest, loyal, and principled, and he becomes more and more outraged at the injustices he sees committed against his fellow man. The film becomes a kind of hagiography, relating the trials and revelations of the idealistic man of the people as his political outrage and determination to change things evolve. We see it happening. Salles spent 3 years researching the film, reading both men's diaries, retracing the journey to find suitable locations. But the film has a timelessness to it, because it focuses on sites of natural beauty or historical significance, but also because in many of the locations little had changed in the past 50 years since the original journey took place. The underlying messages of the film are timeless too: the value of friendship and the need for charity, hospitality, and dignity, lacking in an unjust society which has also seen little improvement over the past 50 years. This is not the story of heroic feats, warns the voiceover and subtitle that open the film, repeated at the end, so we get the point, but the story of two lives that ran parallel for a time. We see Alberto changing too. His youthful exuberance gives way to responsibility as we see him treating patients and getting a job. The protagonist of this film is not El Comandante, the revolutionary who fought alongside Fidel Castro and represented Cuba at the United Nations and was the face that launched 1,000 T-shirts. This is the Che before the beard, the cigar and the beret, although I think this is the German DVD cover, which is clearly capitalising on the image, with the little star on his face as well. He's not yet the self-proclaimed Latin American who travelled from Chile to Mexico, fought in Guatemala and Cuba, and died in Bolivia. However, the knowledge of who he was to become informs the film's focus on his reactions to episodes of exploitation of the poor by the powerful. He is, in the first half of the film, still a dreamer, often portrayed gazing, half frowning into the distance, reading or writing thoughtfully in his diary or writing letters home. And although he has a pistol, the extent of his anger is throwing a stone at a truck. The journey helps the young medical student realise, however, that as a doctor, he would only be able to treat the consequences of the continent's problems. And he eventually concludes that a revolution cannot take place without guns. Although nowadays, when the pandemic permits, it seems that there is a constant flow of tourists and backpackers working their way across South America, the means of transport and border restrictions were different in the 1950s. Then, as now, such an adventure requires finance and time, putting it out of the reach of many. Alberto and Ernesto had the background and education to make their journey possible, but their experiences of hardship and danger on the road were temporary and bearable because of that. During their journey, they realised their privilege for the first time, when their comment that they're travelling for travel's sake, viajar por viajar, is met by incomprehension by those who have been evicted or travel out of economic necessity. In the diary, Ernesto is clearly ashamed, and he imagines that his expedition is parasitic and aimless, in his words, in the eyes of other travellers who have to travel for economic reasons. At the time, 1950s, people knew very little about neighbouring countries beyond basic stereotypes or what they had read. And Ernesto and Alberto say that they know more about distant and ancient civilizations than they did about the great founding civilizations of their own continent, or even their contemporaries in Brazil or Peru. And it's Alberto's first venture outside Argentina. In the first scenes of the film, Alberto confidently draws their route on a map, unaware that it will not be as easy to follow as he thinks. A straight line. At the end of the film, the map serves as a physical reminder, like the souvenir mentioned by Tiago, a physical reminder of how far they have come, literally and figuratively, and Alberto presents it to his travelling companion as a keepsake. Symbolically, Ernesto carries the map and all he has learnt with him into the future. He is the one who flies away to great things, while Alberto watches the plane disappear. A final shot of the real octogenarian Alberto Granado gazing into the distance and remembering his friend shows what he has become all these years later, long after his friend died. Guevara's fate is described in intertitles, as are Granado's achievements, but no images of him post-1952 are shown, avoiding overly politicising the film. The continuous line drawn by Alberto on the map is also the narrative thread of the film, framed by the departure from home and an arrival that is simultaneously a departure towards new horizons. The objective of the trip, to explore the continent, propels the pair forward along with the deadlines they have to respect, Alberto's 30th birthday and the start of the new academic year. They choose movement and the unknown over stagnation and the familiar. The film is shot with loving attention to the spectacular mountains, plains, deserts and jungle, the geographical variety of the continent. The lines formed by the paths, rivers and highways invite us to focus on the vanishing point of the horizon, simultaneously representing the journey and its origin. As the motorcycle adventure proper begins, and the motorcycle conks out halfway through, as Natalia was telling us, but when they do start out on the road, the camera follows the road from the viewpoint of a biker. So first of all, we get the top, we see the top shot. The camera follows the road from the viewpoint of a biker, creating a symmetrical shot in which the lines of perspective lead into the future. Ironically, the motorbike, which in movies such as Easy Rider represents modernity, is soon overtaken by a pair of gauchos on horseback. In a similar scene later in the film, the exhausted protagonists are overtaken by a Peruvian peasant while ascending a mountain road on foot. Modernity and youth are ironically shown wanting in comparison with the traditional skills of the cowboys and the stoic stamina of an indigenous Andean. The hairpin bends that encircle more undulating countryside allow a fixed camera to observe the bike in motion from various angles against stunning backdrops. The film alternates between scenes of travel and pauses, often for conversations with passers-by. In this way, the road symbolically opens up into a land with people. And three crucial breaks in the journey are the campfire conversation with the Chilean mining couple, who in the diary Ernesto calls a living representation of the proletariat, the visit to Machu Picchu, and the stay at the leper colony. The gaunt faces of the Chilean communist and his wife in the firelight recall the faces dark with hunger that Ernesto expected to encounter when he set out, and they prefigure the black and white portraits that provide an emphatic end to the film, which I'll talk about shortly. At Machu Picchu, the viewer watches Ernesto and Alberto's awestruck faces taking in the sight. Both men are unkempt, and Ernesto has the beginnings of a beard that will become part of his revolutionary image. It cannot be by chance that a glimpse of the future icon is engineered in the place where he observes, and I quote, the pure expression of the most powerful indigenous race in the Americas. The sight prompts them to consider alternative pasts that would have changed the present. And that reminds me of what Walter was saying yesterday about alternatives and coincidences. Alberto jokes about wanting to marry a girl descended from the Incas and founding an Indo-American dynasty. But Ernesto, in his birthday speech at the leper colony, is less flippant. He declares that the division of Latin America into unstable and illusory nations is completely fictional, and that we constitute a single mestizo race which bears notable ethnographic similarities, ending with a toast to a united Latin America. The film itself, as a transnational cooperative project, represents just such a dream come true. It's important that this rediscovery of Latin America is made by Latin Americans rather than the foreigners who have traditionally represented it. In his own memoir, published in English as Travelling with Che Guevara, Alberto Granado described his motivation for the journey, saying, "I needed to see the world, but first I wanted to see Latin America, my own long-suffering continent, not through the eyes of a tourist, interested only in landscapes, comforts and fleeting pleasures, but with the eyes and spirit of one of the people, someone wanting to know about the continent's beauty, its riches, the men and women who live there." We can see a kind of transition there because they do start out as they reenact tourist activities like taking photos and pointing out sites to each other. They could not help but be tourists to a great extent. They visit the famous sites, write back letters, and take photos for posterity. And some of those photos exist and appear in the publications of the diaries and served as templates for the film, endorsing its loyalty to the original project. As the men travel northwards, each setting is identified by a white subtitle giving name, the country, the date, and the distance travelled so far, clearly showing movement through time and space. The views labelled thus could even be taken for postcards, were it not the information about the kilometres travelled and the sense of progress. Because it displays famous sites across the continent, the film provides an almost comprehensive introductory guide to Latin America. It's very popular with students. And it has certainly inspired travel companies such as Go Andes to set up tours looks very, very interesting, following in their footsteps in the wake of the film. So you can go on a Motorcycle Diaries for the Modern Traveller trip, and even La Poderosa Tours in Cuba, set up by Guevara's youngest son, Ernesto. Although whether the increased flow of visitors benefits the local inhabitants economically remains to be seen. It has also inspired, there's a Facebook page there called Midlife Motorcycle Diaries that I found, and blogs, travel blogs, documenting more motorcycle diaries of journeys elsewhere around the road, around the world. So the modern motorcycle diaries, the motorcycle diaries. The striking final sequence is a series of black and white shots of the people encountered by Ernesto and Alberto during their journey, now gazing directly at the spectator against the plaintive charango music of the soundtrack. A few of these portraits interrupted the action earlier on in the film, on the riverboat, when the third-class passengers are dragged along in a communal boat with the livestock, and in Lima, after Ernesto starts reading books by the modernist poet César Vallejo and the Marxist intellectual José Carlos Mariátegui. And this technique, foregrounding the faces, what Walter yesterday called human maps, makes it clear that these are moments of epiphany and political awakening sparked through the encounter with real people. Mariátegui's theories about the revolutionary potential of the indigenous peoples and the claim that we are too few to be divided, everything unites us, quoted in the film, proved to Ernesto that not only Europeans think along Marxist lines. The 12 living photos that linger on the screen are carefully composed to present human beings against landscapes associated with their lives or in their workplaces with their colleagues and the tools of their professions. They're reminiscent of the striking and emotive studies of workers and the dispossessed by Brazilian photographer Sebastian Salgado, their eyes not accusing or begging, but simply affirming their presence and identity. As he explained yesterday, Salles was influenced by the work of Martin Chambi, an indigenous Peruvian photographer of the 1920s, who was the first to take the camera out of the studio and photograph people you would never have before seen before as citizens. But in the film, these are not stills, because there are tiny movements to indicate that these people are alive and that their problems exist. It is the faces, rather than simply the words or the views, that remain in Ernesto's mind and are the last images of the journey presented to the audience. Along with the map, they summarise perfectly what has marked him during the course of his 8,000-mile journey. They prove his theory of diversity and unity. They portray a range of ethnicities, but without intertitles now indicating their location, because there is no need. Their identity is clear. They, like Ernesto and Alberto, are proudly Latin American. Thank you.
So I'm so happy to be here today. It's a great pleasure. Thank you so much, Lucia, for organizing this amazing event and for having me in. And so overwhelmed by the beautiful papers we heard this morning. Thank you so much. And so happy to be with Walter Salles here as well. I didn't print my paper, so I'm going to read from my phone. I'm sorry about that. And the title of my paper today is Walter Salles and China, Breaching an Antipodal Distance Effectively. And I started by thinking, whenever you ask a foreigner about Brazilian cinema, they usually say that they've seen or at least heard of one film, Central Station, Central do Brasil. And it's not different in China, where the film is known by its literal translation, Zhongyang Chadang. Walter Salles' 1998 feature is one of those rare instances of a film working as a metonym for a whole cinematography and a whole country. He won the Golden Bear in Berlin in 1998, and it was on that occasion that Salles had his first contact with the work of Chinese filmmaker Jia Zhengke, whose first feature film, Xiao Wu, 1997, was shown at the festival. From this encounter between two artists from the opposite sides of the globe, but whose cinematic worlds often co-inhabit similar aesthetic and emotional territories, emerges a special relationship that has been fruitful in many dimensions. Today, in the special occasion of the Walter Salles Symposium here at Reading, convened by my friend, sensei, Lúcia, constant source of inspiration, Lucia Najib, whose privileged gaze has revealed and enriched the cinema of Walter Salles time and again. I wish to focus on his relationship with the People's Republic of China, its geography, its people, its culture, and its cinema. My main focus will be, firstly, the moments of the making of the miniseries documentary China, the Empire at the Center, edited and produced by Walter Salles and directed by his brother João Moreira Salles, a profound gaze upon a country that was being reshaped by Deng Xiaoping's reforms in the 1980s. Notwithstanding the major differences in style, the documentary invites comparisons with China, Antonioni's Chongguo, made in the early 1970s for television channel Hai. Antonioni is also behind some of the important affinities between Walter Salles and his Chinese colleague Jia Zhengke, affectionately portrayed by Salles in his recent documentary Jia Zhengke, A Guy from Fenyang from 2014, where intertextuality works as a means to reflect upon China's unprecedented transformations and upon the place and the role of cinema within them. So China represents, to Brazilians, usually I think, a paradoxical combination of familiarity and strangeness. So on the one hand, the great transformations that have been ravaging the country in recent decades find a parallel, albeit on a smaller scale, with the accelerated urbanization and socio-political transformations that took place in Brazil in the 20th century, in the second half of the 20th century. On the other hand, China was until recently, an isolated country, shrouded in an aura of intangibility and mystery. Today, thanks to its growing prominence in the global economic and geopolitical landscape, the whole world seems to be turning its eyes towards China. If I'm not mistaken, and Walter will be able to correct me, Walter Salles has been to China 3 times in his life. The first trip was in 1979 and lasted around a month. Salles was still quite young, and he has emphasized in interviews the impact of this first encounter with China, and especially of reaching as far south as Guilin, near the border with Vietnam, at a time when the two countries fought a brief war. He was one of the few foreigners to venture this far at a time when the country was beginning to open up after the Cultural Revolution. I wonder if Salles has photographs or other records of that trip that made a deep impression on him, not only from the point of view of the encounter with the other, but also, more importantly, from the affective nature of this encounter, described as both curious and warm. More recently, in 2017, we were also able to see incredible images of China as shot by Salles' mother in October 1966, and articulated as found footage by João Moreira Salles in the essay film In the Intense Now, No Intenso Agora. The group of cultural tourists organized by French magazine Connaissance des Arts was one of the last, if not the last, to be allowed to travel to China during the Cultural Revolution, which had begun a few months earlier in May of that year. These grainy, colorful images also evoke as an audiovisual memory Antonioni's masterful documentary, China, shot in 1972 for Hai television network. This was 6 years after the launch of the Cultural Revolution and followed a period of great isolation for China and turmoil. Antonioni was then given unprecedented, if always supervised, access to the country. This is a 3-part documentary that lasts 120 minutes and is punctuated here and there by Antonioni's voiceover commentary in Italian. I would say that generally speaking, the film, this documentary, is very much built from a photographic mode, centered around an observational camera that lingers on people's faces. Most of them return the gaze to the camera and stare back at us, and invite us to ponder on its ability, the camera's ability, to reveal their secrets, to penetrate their inner life, to see what is hidden in the interstices, despite the atmosphere of secretiveness and control. The Cultural Revolution ended in 1976 in China, and by the late 70s, the country, when Walter Salles first went there, had started to change under the helm of Deng Xiaoping, who implemented the period known as reform and opening up, 改革开放. This led China into market economics, completely revolutionizing the country's social tapestry and not least its geography. In 1986, at the height of these reforms, Walter Salles returned to China, accompanied by his brother João Moreira Salles, to shoot a documentary entitled China, the Empire of the Center, China, o Império do Centro, which was shown on TV Manchete in 1987. A year before, Salles had directed the documentary miniseries Japan, A Journey in Time, also aired by TV Manchete. The trip meant a new encounter with a country that had begun to change dramatically. This encounter had a new dimension to the young filmmaker, in that it meant making sense of China, of a country and its culture, but in audiovisual form. Editing meant going through almost 600 hours of filmed and archival material for a period of 6 months, resulting in 2 blocks subdivided into 13 thematic chapters, narrated with great panache by José Wilke, the actor. It is important to point out that in the 1980s, Brazilian documentary was still very much indebted to the principles of so-called sociological cinema, in Jean-Claude Bernadette's terms, privileging a didactic, informative, or expository mode aimed at teaching or educating the public. But for all its conventionalities, Salles' documentary not only opened a window into China after decades of isolation, providing a great overview of a country still not very well known by Brazilians, but also embraced at times innovative and unexpected aesthetic choices, such as the pairing of the music of Henrique Satie and Albinoni with images of Beijing and Shanghai, and the extensive use of Chinese poetry as punctuation for different moments in the narration. Moreover, its significance becomes even more poignant today. I was watching the documentary again and I was very impressed by this, especially because it gives a lot of time, it devotes a lot of its time to the province of Xinjiang and the Taklamakan deserts in the northwest China. Now all but a very secretive location, mostly inaccessible to foreign cameras, enraged in controversy for its systematic suppression of the local Islamic culture. In the documentary China, and in hindsight, one of the most astonishing moments comes with the interviews of the Muslim Chinese about the importance of keeping their language and their Islamic culture alive. The final part of the documentary miniseries was dedicated to the masterpiece Yellow Earth, made in 1984, which was also aired on Brazilian television only 3 years before it was, after it was made, so in 1987. Yellow Earth is considered the inaugural film of the so-called fifth generation of Chinese cinema, whose films were the first to be shown in the West after decades of isolation, arriving in Brazil mainly through the Mostra Internacional de São Paulo, the São Paulo International Film Festival. Here, it seems relevant to evoke Juliana Bruno's understanding of cinema as a spatial art form, akin to architecture, and to highlight the importance of the shift in emphasis from sight to sight, from optic to haptic. Bruno breaks with the notion of filmic space as an inheritor of Renaissance perspective and transforms the film spectator, traditionally seen as a voyeur, into a voyageur, one who embarks on an emotional journey through different sites. Film can thus produce a virtual memory of space or spaces, both distant and familiar, working as an imaginary form of flânerie. Salles' flânerie through China, then, set in motion by the traveling medium, that is audiovisual media, created memories and impressions of a country that he was gradually becoming more familiar with. Yellow Earth is set in the 1930s and tells the story of a soldier from a propaganda department of the CCP's 8th Route Army who goes to a poor village in Shanxi to collect folk songs. It was directed by Chen Kai-ge and photographed by Zhang Yimou, who were to become the two main names of the fifth generation of Chinese cinema and would change the direction of the cinematography of Chinese cinema through a conscious desire to modernize its language, drawing inspiration from European cinema and quite prominently from Antonioni's sense of space, understanding of space. Yellow Earth has echoes of The Passenger in its images of landscape. It was shot in Shanxi province in the north of the country, a land covered in the yellow earth from the lowest plateau and crossed by the Yellow River. The river is yellow because of the earth that's yellow there. Its style, use of location, long takes, and strong documentary overtones differed radically from previous ideological films. Not by chance, Yellow Earth is credited by director Jia Zhengke as the film that made him wish to become a filmmaker. There are notable affinities between the lands of Yellow Earth and Jia Zhengke's hometown province of Shanxi, also located in the lowest plateau and crossed by the Yellow River, the mother river in China. The importance of landscape in his cinema is one of the most notable traits explored by Walter Salles in his feature-length documentary, Jia Zhengke, Guy from Fenyang, which pays homage to the life and work of Jia Zhengke, accompanying him to his hometown of Fenyang in Shanxi province and to Beijing, visiting some of the most prominent film locations across his filmography, including films such as Xiaowu, Platform, The World, and A Touch of Sin. An incredibly knowledgeable and acute cinephile, Walter Salles' enormously generous spirit lent itself to a sophisticated and effective investigation of Jia Zhengke's cinema and sensibility, rendered not only in audiovisual form, but also in an essay of such rare eloquence and depth as Em Busca de Ulaanbaatar, In Search of Ulaanbaatar, published in the beautiful book O Mundo de Jia Zhengke, The World of Jia Zhengke, that he co-organized with Jean-Michel Frodon for Cosaque Naïf and the São Paulo International Film Festival. And if adjectives overflow in these last few sentences, is that I really struggle to find in the lexicon ways to convey the importance and dimension of this labor of love. Beautifully shot by Inti Briones and edited by Joana Collier, the film interweaves visits to real locations and interviews with Jia and his close collaborators with numerous clips from his films. The underlying question is that of memory of space, under threat in contemporary China, a country whose space of transformations equals a form of violence. Some of the film clips are edited alongside locations as they were in 2014 and thus reveal how much has changed in such a short time. During the shoot, another dimension to Jia's work and his sensibility emerged in the form of memories of his father, a crucial figure to the artist that he has become, and whose absence is felt and mourned by Jia in the affective space created by Salles' camera. In these at once marvelous and unexplainable convergences engendered by the world of cinema, I couldn't help noticing how searching for the father is also an important thematic configuration in Walter Salles' fiction cinema. And despite the fact that he never features on screen or in the soundtrack, the film leaves us with the unstated impression that these two very different directors also share a common sensibility. I will now show you a clip from the film in which Jajanka returns to his childhood home in the old part of Fenian. Just bear.
我们几个在表演，我们自信
中国的这种社会啊或者现状的东西吧，比较了解。
我还要给他讲一个秘密，你知道就是这些房间以前我们住进来之前是做什么的吗？我们住进来之前是汾阳的监狱，里面的墙特别厚，然后有时候我要淘气的话，我妈妈就会吓我说：“这个是监狱，我以前把你关起来。”这个院子就变成我们自己的一个世界。不好意思，听那个 K P 啊，为什么这样话还是在？是。哎，那个你能不能开一下整呢？他们就说，这是修了哈。因为来生活徒步来的，行。
我在23年我来的时候，别
做长征啊，那人家走的都他走后。
你是给他做的，那是？
不是，正常来的，走后。这个墙壁更能进点啊，那个啊。放点好了，
那你得写下这个。
这边以前这边是炕。
Okay, I'm going to have to stop because apparently I'm completely running out of time, but I have two quick paragraphs, so I'll be very quick. So there's a lot of different things that I wanted to. Where's my PowerPoint? There. Sorry. Yeah. So there are many dimensions to this 3-minute clip that I was trying to show you to the end. I didn't manage to. I thought it was 3 minutes, but I'll quickly sketch it. Giuliana Bruno has famously written on how motion and emotion are interrelated in the cinema, and cinema is the traveling narrative par excellence, as we heard today, and how dislocations through landscape also necessarily entail changes in one's internal landscape. This interconnection between exterior and interior, between the mind and the physical world come to the fore in this powerful sequence where memory's spatial dimension is highlighted. Memory is thus here a point of connection between the event remembered, the person remembering, and the place of the remembered. Moreover, in both films, Xiaowu and Jia, a guy from Fenyang, the present and spatial nature of memories is made even more evident through the gesture of touching the wall. And you can see here, Jia touches the wall of his old house. Here, as if touch is giving memory a shape, a form, making it present, making it spatial, making it palpable. A memory at hand's reach. It should also be noted how these spatial dynamics of memory, akin to cinema's own spatial dynamics, is recurrently conveyed in the long takes associated with a handheld camera employed to traverse the meandering corridors, side streets and patios that make up the web of courtyard residences still standing in Fenyang. And here another dimension of this memory emerges, for these walls that carry the subjective memory of the characters and of Jia himself belong to a traditional courtyard cave dwelling known as Guyao, which is typical of the lowest plateau and of this region of the Yellow Earth, and it's also seen in Chiang Kai-shek's film Yellow Earth, sort of contributing to all these convergences that I'm trying to trace here. And these are being now knocked down and destroyed in Jia hometown. I have one more paragraph, but I think I'll have to stop. I was going to go on and talk about landscape and faces. And I was going to finish, and maybe I can just read this one sentence by Jia, which is the opening sentence of Walter Salles' Jia guy from Fenyang. And Jia says, "I have such appreciation for the camera, for without it I could not capture the details of life, and I would be left with all I feel inside. What is precious is here, in this human ocean. If you look at each one of these faces, you discover each individual in their dignity. The camera allows me to bring this to light, to make this reality alive on screen." So I have images of Yellow Earth and 21st City with moving portraits, and Central Station with landscape and faces, and Motorcycle Diaries moving portraits. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry that
Okay, first of all, my deepest gratitude to Walter Salles for helping us complete and extend and develop our project of building a bridge between what we do in academia and the industry, the film industry. Filmmakers, most of them have no idea of the efforts that we put into analyzing their films for years and years and years on end. And they just read the newspapers, the short reviews that people saw very quickly and just gave 3 stars, 2 stars, or no stars, and get depressed about that. Whereas we are doing fantastic work, passionate work about what they are doing, diving into their works for years. So that's our effort, and I'm so grateful that Walter accepted to make a break in his incredibly busy schedule to be here today to support this project that we are trying to carry out. So thank you so much. Thank you, Walter. Foreign Land, Terra Estrangeira, directed by Walter Salles and Daniela Thomas in 1995, has gained new relevance in the face of Brazil's disastrous government currently in power. It allows us to view today's political crisis not as a historical blip, but as the result of foundational myths dating back to the country's colonial past. The film focuses on the brief ruling of a previous nefarious government in the early 1990s, which caused a massive exodus of unemployed Brazilians to the old colonial center, Portugal. Shot mainly on location in São Paulo, Lisbon, and Cape Verde, it promotes the encounter of Lusophone peoples who find common ground in their marginal situation. Viewed from afar, their native countries are reduced to invisible proportions, despite their great territorial extensions. Even Portugal is defined by its location at the edge of Europe and by echoes of Sebastianism, whose origins go back to the time when it was dominated by Spain. As a result, notions of core or center are devolved to the realm of the myth. This paper attempts to demonstrate how a perspectival shift between great and small, center and periphery, permeates the film at all levels and accounts for its enduring qualities. Foreign Land was one of the first signs of cinematic revival after the collapse of Brazilian film production following the drastic measures introduced in 1990 by the newly elected president Collor de Mello. Traumatic image on the screen. As well as freezing the bank accounts of the entire population, the Collor government closed down several cultural institutions, including Embrafilme, hitherto responsible for most of the country's film production and distribution. Bereft of any state support, Foreign Land emerged as an independent production conceived and developed collaboratively by a group of art professionals determined to keep the country's film culture alive. The script was co-written by Walter Salles, Daniela Thomas, and Marcus Bernstein, with additional dialogues by Milor Fernandes. Editing was carried out by Salles himself together with Felipe Lacerda. Thomas's cousin, Fernando Alves Pinto, then a beginner, was cast for the lead, and other professional actors such as Fernanda Torres, Alexandre Borges, Laura Cardoso, and Chequi Cario were hired on the basis of friendship or reduced fees. Black and white 16mm stock, later blown up to 35mm, was chosen as a more economical and agile format for location shooting, though explored to stylistic heights by Brazil's foremost DOP, Walter Carvalho. Shooting was completed in just 4 weeks, despite taking place in 3 different continents. On the level of the fable, Foreign Land is all about defeat and loss of self-esteem. The main character, Paco, represents one of the 800,000 emigrants who left the country during the less than 2-year period of the Collor government. His Basque immigrant mother, Manuela, dies of a heart attack when she realizes from a government TV broadcast, and another traumatic image here, that her meager savings meant to finance her trip back to San Sebastian have been confiscated. Left on his own, Paco falls prey to Igor, a Mephistophelian character who offers him a trip to Portugal. He thus becomes unwittingly embroiled in an international scheme of diamond trafficking. In Lisbon, Paco meets and falls for another expatriate Brazilian older than him, Alex, whose junkie saxophonist boyfriend has just been killed in a diamond-related dispute. Paco and Alex make their way towards what becomes for them an ersatz homeland, San Sebastian, but are caught up by the enemy along the way. Its former modesty and defeatist storyline notwithstanding, the film displays a considerable intellectual thrust. The range of cinematic references resorted to includes Wells and Touch of Evil for the camera work, Antonioni for the meditative scenes, the Nouvelle Vague, as well as Wim Wenders' early films for the black and white and location shots, Huston's The Treasure of the Sierra Madre for the lost diamonds at the end, and many others. Literary citations abound, including Goethe, Euripides, Shakespeare, Vinícius de Moraes, and Fernando Pessoa. Despite his humble origin, Paco, who lives on the earnings of his seamstress mother, intends to become an actor and take the role of no less than Faust in Goethe's classic play. In the opening scene of Foreign Land, Paco is rehearsing the verses from which the film title is extracted and which express Faust's delusion of power. I'm just going to read the last verses of this. Let them drop down the golden atmosphere and bear me forth to new and varied being. Yeah, if a magic mantle once were mine, to waft me over the world at pleasure, I would not for the costliest stores of treasure, not for a monarch's robe, the gift resign. Here in the English translation, we don't have Foreign Land, but in Portuguese there is, as you can see here. Desçam dessa atmosfera áurea e levem-me daqui para uma vida nova e variada, que manto mágico seja meu e me carregue para a terra estrangeira. So, Foreign Lands comes from this verse. Inspired by these verses, later on in the film, Paco will gather courage to face a bunch of powerful enemies and flee with Alex, thus unleashing the chase sequence that drive the plot to its climax. The shipwreck, which Goethe's hero is unafraid of, also re-emerges in the film's iconography. Terra Estrangeira, moreover, resonates with Glauber Rocha's famous Land trilogy, Trilogia da Terra, which includes Deus e Diabo na Terra do Sol, Terra em Transe, and A Idade da Terra. So perhaps you can see the translations here. In English it doesn't make much sense, it's all land, but in Portuguese the term terra signifies at the same time the land, the country, and the entire earth. By revisiting 16th century utopian myths derived from the discovery imaginary, such as the belief in El Dorado in the New World and the island of Utopia itself, Rocha developed a powerful imagery of cosmogonic deserts and water expanses to express his hero's great expectations in contrast with the country's tragic reality. According to Salles, at the origin of the film are the photographs of a shipwreck on the Cape Verde coast taken by Jean-Pierre Favreau. Salles and Thomas took their crew and cast to Cape Verde to shoot the lead couple in their flight to San Sebastian against the backdrop of this shipwreck. Although at this point in the story, Paco and Alex are still unscathed, and like Goethe's hero, unafraid of the world, the metaphorical shipwreck indicates their forthcoming defeat. It also provides a visual rhyme to the old ship bound for some unknown destination mentioned in the song Vapor Barato, Cheap Steamer, by Jardim Macalé and Wally Salomon, sung by Alex in the diegesis and Gal Costa in the extra diegetic soundtrack. These poetic ship metaphors gain consistency and historical resonance in a key scene of the film. So I'll just describe the scene briefly. Paco and Alex find themselves in Cape Espichel, defined in the film as Europe's furthest westerly point, seated at the edge of a precipice beyond which lies the vast open sea. For a moment, the sea fills the frame before the camera drifts back to capture Alex and Paco from behind, looking out to the sea before them. Now I'm going to show this scene, and so you can understand the dialogue and what goes on.
Você não tem nem ideia de onde você está, né? Isso aqui é a ponta da Europa. Isso aqui, ó, é o fim. Coragem, né? Cruzar esse mar há 500 anos atrás. É que eles achavam que o paraíso estava ali, ó. Coitados portugueses. Acabaram descobrindo o Brasil. Tá rindo quem?
Okay, so just turn the page. Though connected by the dialogue to the imaginary of the discovery of Brazil's foundational myths, this maritime scene presents a decisive difference from Glauber Rocha's maritime imagery, in that they are territorially attached to Portugal rather than Brazil. Thus, through a radical perspective shift, Brazil's situation is redefined as periphery and its territory reduced to irrelevant, even invisible proportions within a global context. As a result, Brazil's foundational myth becomes the butt of a joke. For Marilena Chauí, one of the effects of the foundational myth at the base of Brazilian authoritarian regimes is to reassert the belief in the country as a gift from God and nature, whose problems derive from external causes, among them the colonization by Portugal rather than another supposedly better European nation, France and Holland being some of the alternative countries which in the early colonial times had attempted to capture Brazil from the Portuguese domain without success. By adopting an external point of view, the maritime scene in foreign land turns this myth on its head, and Brazil becomes the bedluck in Portuguese history rather than the other way round. Accordingly, its protagonist, Paco, is characterized as a downgraded descendant of 16th century heroes. Verbal puns and explicative dialogue make such connections explicit. Paco's full name is Francisco Eizaguirre, a surname which Igor, played by the forceful theater actor Luis Mello, pronounces detachedly as Eizaguirre, in a reference to Don Lope de Aguirre, the Spanish conquistador who famously sailed to South America in search of El Dorado, and brought the scene and was brought to the screen by Werner Herzog in Aguirre, The Wrath of God. But when Igor compares Paco to legendary gold and diamond hunters, this is just a way of enticing the unsuspecting youngster to become a mule in his international smuggling operation. This wiping out of the Brazilian nation through a perspective shift offers the filmmakers, moreover, an opportunity to reconnect with Wim Wenders, of whom Salles is a self-confessed admirer, and whose early works are structured upon the character of the modern wanderer in search of an elusive homeland. In particular, Wim Wenders' The State of Things prefigures foreign land with its displaced characters lodged in a shipwreck hotel half sunk into the sea. Is it what you have seen there? And the view of Portugal at the edge of the world, and its postmodern sense of the end of cinema and storytelling. Some apparently random options in the film in fact resonate with both Portuguese and Brazilian history and mythology. One of them is the choice of San Sebastian as Manuela's birthplace, a city which in the film is endowed with a sort of mystic aura. This is firstly due to the location of the city in the Basque country, known for its long-lasting struggle for national identity and the uniqueness of its language. Secondly, the constant evocation of San Sebastian in the film brings inevitable associations with Sebastianism. This myth, perpetuated through a number of religious sects over the centuries, both in Portugal and Brazil, harks back to the episode of the disappearance of Dom Sebastian, o Desejado, Sebastian, or Sebastian I, the Desired, King of Portugal, in the Battle of Czar el-Kebir in Morocco in 1578. Following a protracted dynastic dispute, Philip II, King of Spain, was made King of Portugal in 1581, and the country remained annexed to Spain for the following 60 years. As a result, a belief took shape in Portugal that Sebastian was not dead and would eventually return to redeem the Portuguese people from the Spanish hands. The essence of Sebastianism can thus be summarized as a nostalgia or saudade in Portuguese for the lost homeland. Sebastianism was introduced in Brazil in early colonial times and acquired the form of a conservative attachment to monarchy after the establishment of the Republican regime in 1889. The famous rebellions of Canudos and Pedra Bonita, focused on by Glauber Rocha in Black God, White Devil, were Sebastianist movements, animated by the hope that Sebastian would return in the person of a messianic savior to redeem the poor. In Rocha's Black God, White Devil, Sebastianism is represented by the messianic leader São Sebastian, Saint Sebastian, who utters the apocalyptical prophecy that the backlands will turn to sea and the sea into backlands. Foreign Land's structure is thus a mise en abîme, as it suggests the cyclical recurrence of the search for the lost homeland throughout history. San Sebastian, a city in search of a land, reflects Sebastianism, originated in a time when Portugal had ceased to be an independent nation in the 16th century, a situation which comes to inflect the story of Brazilian expatriates in a moment of national crisis in the present. This prompts the revision of the maritime utopia of the discovery, explored by Rocha as allegories of Brazil's contemporary problems. In turn, the plight of the 16th century discoverers, who risked their lives in search of gold and precious stones, reflects on the lives of current Brazilian emigrants, involved as they are with trafficking in diamonds and drugs. As a whole, Foreign Land upends any idea of national pride elicited by the internal point of view. At the same time, the film declares allegiance to a self-reflexive postmodern cinema keen on meta-language and citation, a trend Noel Carroll once dubbed allusionism. By paying homage to film and literature giants through the filter of Wenders and Rocha, it universalizes the question of the loss of identity, thus reducing and relativizing the importance of the national imagery or imaginary. However, its anti-utopian images and text refer to a degraded middle class for whom the comparison of Brazil to El Dorado had made a certain sense until Collor's recessive government put a provisional end to it. Rather than the oppressed masses Rocha had focused on, the story here is about characters who led a decent life, suffused with intellectual and artistic ambitions before they were forced into exile and lowly or illegal jobs. Indeed, the social problems pointed out in Foreign Land proved circumstantial. Brazil's political and financial situation soon improved with Collor's impeachment in 1992 and the establishment of the democratic neoliberal government of President Fernando Henrique Cardoso in 1993. I'm finishing. The Cardoso government immediately put in place a new audiovisual law allowing tax discount for film funding, which entailed a new cinematic boom known as the retomada do cinema brasileiro, the Brazilian film revival, whose first outputs appeared in the mid-1990s. The most representative film of this batch, internationally feted as the symbol of Brazil's cinematic revival, was Central Station. In it, the mythic center, which had been lost in Foreign Land, is regained and clearly identified with Brazil from the film's very title, which in Portuguese means the center of Brazil, as well as the name of a real train station. Brazil is in desperate need of another radical reversal right now. away from foundational and religious myths. Let us see what Salles' forthcoming film, I'm Still Here, has to say about that. Thank you very much.
Really interesting sort of ways to think about how Walter Salles' work sort of traverses space, presents place, and I think I saw a wonderful sort of intersection between the ideas, but at the same time each one of them spoke in very distinct ways about the work. So any questions?
Not time.
First of all, thank you so much for your papers. It's really thought-provoking. Thank you. I would like to ask, we actually discussed briefly the open-ended narrative. And I would just like to ask Lucia, because you talked about how they evoke the ship again. So how do you interpret this scene at the end where the characters are in a getaway car? So what is the role of evoking the ship within this framework of the foundation myth? So what is the role of evoking it while going full speed through the Spanish border? How do you interpret that?
Yeah, it's interesting. Going to Spain in the film is going to Europe, and you need to enter Europe. It's interesting because that's how we feel in Britain these days. Is how do we get into Europe? Let's go to Europe, whereas we should be part of it. And Portugal in the film is also kind of separated from Europe in the sense that traveling to Spain is breaking that barrier between the two. But I think the ship is connected to that myth of the discovery, clearly, because we have a shipwreck there, the ship that had sunk and has been abandoned, in a mission that connects probably the colonial power of Portugal, and in the film we are not told that it's Cape Verde. We know that it's Cape Verde. So it is, again, because this myth of the discovery is constantly alluded to during the film. So I think you put it very well as the stasis, the ship signifying the stasis. So something that had sunk, a project that had failed. And so we have that failed project there. I like the comparison with Wim Wenders' film because the entire hotel is a sunk kind of ship, is a shipwreck as well, and it's at the border of the sea. And so I think there is this contrast between the movement and stasis and this disruption of the journey, and the need to reverse the perspective, which is played out within the film. And perhaps to overcome this mythical situation, this awaiting for Sebastian, to come back and save us from this dependence from another country or from a messianic force that's going to redeem us. I think that's overcoming this situation is the project inside the film.
Lúcia, if I may, there's a clear death drive in the end at the end final scene of Terra Estrangeira, because he's dying. So they're not just fleeing; he's actually dying there.
But we don't know. We don't know if he's died.
He's shot.
Yes,
he's shot.
Looks pretty bad, but
it looks pretty bad.
It depends how hopeful we are. Is he wearing hope underwear? Yeah.
We have another question.
I just had a question, which just came to me as you were all speaking, that there seems to be like mixed fascination and abhorrence on the part of the films you describe with colonialism. So on one hand, you have this notion, like in Motorcycle Diaries, where by traveling the continent, there seems to be this subtext: we don't want the Spanish conquistadors, we are united as people of Latin America, so clear abhorrence of the colonial power. Whereas you have in Foreign Land and Globe Rocha, like you mentioned, a sort of longing for a Sebastianism, which ironically is, you know, a colonial power and occupier, which then becomes a metaphoric, you know, savior of some sort. How do you see this?
Well,
this
in Glauber Horscher, it's a dialectical position, because Manuel is between two forces. He is between the forces of God and the forces of devil. The devil there is the revolution, but both are portrayed as myth. That's the beauty of the film in Glauber Horscher. So there is that endless dilemma that he has to decide, but both seem to be promising the same thing, and both seem to be unattainable. Because when Manuel runs on the desert towards the sea, he doesn't meet the sea. It's the editing, the film, that meets the sea. In the 400 Blows, where Glauber took the scene from, when Antoine Doinel runs on the beach, he gets to the sea, puts his feet in the sea, feels the water, sees the sea that he had never seen, and comes back. But that doesn't happen. So it's an individual journey. Manuel's journey is a social journey, a journey of revolution. And obviously, Glauber Horscher was saying that it is impossible for us to escape our history, our past. We carry our past. We carry that load, that inheritance of colonialism. We have to. Yeah, we have to overcome that. And again, there is a big question mark at the end of the film. There is the drive, the driving force, which Ismail Xavier so beautifully defined as the movement forward, the teleology of history that breaks the circular motif that's played out in the film with the camera. The camera is constantly circular. And the run of Manuel breaks this circular motif with the teleology of history. We are going somewhere, but we don't know where.
Cecilia or Claire, would you like to respond as well? Or?
No.
Okay.
No, I think you put it beautifully. I suppose Alberto and Ernesto are moving away from myth towards reality, and they're also they're not colonizers, but they are strangers traveling who have the luxury of traveling through the countries, and they kind of melt into their identities melt from strangers into part of the communities, especially when they get to the leper colony. So it's a bit like that.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I could ask. Yeah, just a very quick one for everyone. I mean, I'm thinking of the films that you've been discussing, and how we can read them in the context of Latin American cinema or Hispanic cinema, or even a Lusophone cinema, if you want to term that, and then moving on to world cinema. These are all very academic terms. They're very Anglo-focused and Anglo-created kind of terms. But when we come to teach films, very often we do resort to the films of Walter Salles as really interesting illustrations of all of these kinds of cinemas. But are they unique? I mean, I'm trying to think, in the mid-1990s, was there another Brazilian filmmaker addressing the relationship between Brazil and Portugal, for example? And even into the mid-2000s, were there other Brazilian filmmakers who were really reaching out and thinking about Brazil in the context of Latin America, which is a context that so many Brazilians deny, deny being part of. Latin America is something else, isn't it? Yeah. So just wondering what your thoughts are.
There was a line of funding between Portugal and Brazil at the time, in the 90s, that Walter will be able to enlighten me more about it. You have the film by Hans Staden, for example, was benefited by that agreement so much that the ship of that sinks in Hans Staden was shot in the Tejo, in the Tagus, in Portugal, so it pretends to be the sea, but it's there. All the rest was shot in Ubatuba, where the history started. There was another, there is the beautiful Bocage by Djalma Limonge Batista, which is all about, it's benefited from that agreement as well. And so during the Retomada, there was that desire and drive to reconnect with Portugal and the Portuguese origins. Interestingly, Bocage is spoken in Latin because of the poems that Bocage wrote in Latin and in Portuguese from Portugal. So it's an entirely Brazilian film, but completely Portuguese as well. I think that desire to reconnect with the sense, also because, as in Terra Estrangeira, Portugal has been now deprived from the aura of the former colonizer. It feels itself again as subjected or diminished in relation to Europe and to Spain, and the focus in the film is totally on the immigrants from the former colonies. And there is that beautiful phrase extracted from Fernando Pessoa that is spoken by the bookseller, who is a musician and bookseller in the film, who says, Portugal, Lisboa não é uma terra para se encontrar ninguém, é uma terra para você se perder de você mesmo. Né? Então, there is all that self-reflexivity about Portugal, as well as decadent, as having lost all that aura of the colonial center. Cecília, would you like to say something about the world cinema side of it?
You don't have to, Cecília. You know, it's more.
No, I just love that paper about China, and all the things about China, and touching the wall.
Yeah.
And Jordana Bruno, who I don't like very much, but she made me like her today because of all that. But that haptic thing I don't buy into that very much. But in that sense, it really made a lot of sense because, the walls that are disappearing.
The walls that are disappearing, yeah.
That was so solid. Look at the size of this wall, and then it's gone.
Yeah. Definitely.
I
think,
I'll just say I agree with Steph, and thank Walter Salles and his collaborators and his cast and crew, because for us who are teaching Brazilian cinema, Latin American cinema, world cinema, these films are really, they're go-to films. They are at the core of what we do, and they're such beautiful films, and they enable us to talk about so much. So I'm very grateful.
We are at the end of the panel time, so can everyone please join me in thanking all of the speakers.